At Ilfurt, 5 miles south of Mulhausen in Alsace, is a monument consisting of a stone column 30 feet high surmounted with a statue of the Immaculate Conception, and upon the plinth of the pillar may be read the following remarkable inscription: In memoriam perpetuam liberationis duorum possessorum Theobaldi et Josephi Berner, obtentai per intercessionem Beatae Mariae Virginis Immaculat, anno Domini 1869. Joseph Berner and Anna Maria, his wife, were poor but intelligent persons who were not merely respected, but even looked up to for their probity and industry by their fellows villagers of Ilfurt. The family consisted of 5 children, the eldest son, Thibou, being born on 21st August 1855, and the second, Joseph, on 29th April 1857. They were quiet lads of average ability, who, when 8 years old, were sent in the usual course to the local elementary school. In the autumn of 1864, both were seized with a mysterious illness, which would not yield to the ordinary remedies. Dr. Levy of Altkirch, who was called in to examine the case, acknowledged himself completely baffled, and a number of other doctors who were afterwards consulted declared themselves unable to diagnose such extraordinary symptoms. From 25th September 1865, the 2 boys displayed most abnormal phenomena. Whilst lying on their backs, they spun suddenly round like whirling tops with the utmost rapidity. Convulsions seized them, twisting and distorting every limb with unparalleled mobility. Or again, their bodies would for hours together become absolutely rigid and motionless, so that no joint could be bent, whilst they lay motionless as stocks or stones. Fearful fits of vomiting often concluded these attacks. Sometimes they were dumb for days and could only gibber and mow with blazing eyes and slabbering lips. Sometimes they were deaf, so that even a pistol fired close to their ears had not the slightest effect. Often they became fantastically excited, gesticulating wildly and shouting incessantly. Their voices were, however, not their normal tones nor even those of children at all, but the strong, harsh, hoarse articulation of rough and savage men. For hours together they would blaspheme in the foulest terms, cursing and swearing and bawling out such hideous obscenities that the neighbors took to flight in sheer terror at the horrible scenes, whilst the distracted parents knew not whence to turn for help or comfort. Not only did the sufferers use the filthy vocabulary of the lowest slums, but they likewise spoke with perfect correctness and answered fluently in different languages, in French, Latin, English, and even in most varied dialects of Spanish and Italian, which could by no possible means have been known to them in their normal state. Nor could they at any time have heard conversation in these languages and subconsciously assimilated it. A famous case is on record where a servant girl of mean education fell ill and during a delirium began to mutter and babble in a language which was recognized as Syriac. This was considered to be accounted for when it was discovered that formerly she had been in service in a house where there was lodging a theological student, who upon the eve of his examinations used to walk up and down stairs and pace his rooms saying aloud to himself Syriac roots and vocables, which she thus often overheard and which in this way registered themselves in her brain. But there could not be any such explanation in the case of this Thibou and Joseph Berner, since they did not merely reel out disconnected words and phrases in any 1 or 2 tongues, but conversed easily and sensibly in a large variety of languages and even in dialects. This has always been considered one of the genuine signs of diabolic possession, as is stated in the third article of De Exorcisandis Obsessis a Demonio 3. In primis, ne facile credat, aliquem a demonio obsessum esse, sed nota habeat ea signa, quibus obsessus dignoscitur ab is, qui uel atrabile, uel morbo aliquo laborant. Signa autem obsidentis daemonic sunt, ignota lingua loqui pluribus verbis uel loquentem intelligere, distantia et occulta patefacere, uire super aetatis seu conditionis naturam ostendere, et id genus alia, quae cum plurima concurrunt, maiora sunt indicia. Moreover, both Thibou and Joseph Berner repeatedly and in exactest detail described events which were happening at a distance, and upon investigation their accounts were afterwards found to be precisely true in every particular. Their strength was also abnormal, and often in their paroxysms and convulsions it needed the utmost exertions of 3 powerful men severally to hold these lads who were but 9 and 7 years old. It was noticed at the very beginning of these maladies that the patient were thrown into the most violent fits, and every symptom of disease and disorder exacerbated by the presence of any sacramental such as holy water or medals, rosaries, and other objects which had been blessed according to the ritual. They seemed particularly enraged by the blessed medal of Saint Benedict and pictures of Our Lady of Perpetual Succor. On one occasion, Monsieur Ignace Spies, the mayor of Celestat, a man of exceptional devotion and piety, held before their eyes a relic of S. Gerard Magella, the Redemptorist thaumaturge, when their shrieks and yells were truly terrific, finally dying away in inhuman whines and grew despair. It so happened that a Corpus Christi procession passed the house, opposite which an altar of repose had been erected. The children, who were in bed, knew nothing of this and seemed to lie in a deep stupor. However, as the Blessed Sacrament approached, their behavior is said to have been indescribable. They poured forth torrents of filth and profanity, distorting their limbs into 1,000 unnatural postures, their eyes almost starting from their heads, a crisis which was succeeded by a sudden horrible composure, whilst they crept away into the furthest corners of the room, moaning, panting, and retching as if in mortal agony. Above all, pictures and medals of Our Lady and the invocation of her most holy name filled the possessed with terror and rage. At any mention of the Great Lady, as they termed her, they would curse and howl in so monstrous a way that all who had heard them shook and sweated with fear. The Abbé Charles Bray, parish priest of Ilfert, quickly made up his mind as to the diabolic nature of the phenomena. It was an undoubted case of possession, since in no other way could what was taking be explained. Accordingly, he sent to his diocesan, Monsignor Andreas Ras, 1842-87, a full account of such extraordinary and fearful events. The bishop, however, was far from satisfied that these things could not be accounted for naturally. In fact, it was only after 3 or 4 years' delay that at the instance of the Dean of Altkirch, he decided to order a special ecclesiastical investigation. He finally appointed for this task 3 acute theologians, Monsignor Stumpf, superior of his grand seminary at Strasbourg, Monsignor Freiberger, vicar general of the diocese, and Monsieur Sester, rector of Mulhausen. These priests, then, presented themselves unexpectedly at the Berners' house on Tuesday morning, the 13th of April, 1369, at 10 o'clock. It was found that Joseph Berner had already concealed himself, and it was only after a prolonged search he could with difficulty be dragged from under his bed where he had taken refuge. Thibou feigned to be unconscious in the presence of strangers. The inquiry lasted for more than 2 hours, and it was not until past noon that the investigators left the house. Meanwhile, they had witnessed the most hideous scenes, and their minds were quite made up as to the reality of the possession. They shortly presented their report to the bishop, who then, and not until then, allowed himself to be convinced of the facts. Even so, the prudent prelate ordered fresh precautions to be taken at the beginning of September 1869. Thibou was conveyed in the company of his unhappy mother to the orphanage of S. Charles at Schiltigheim, where he was to be lodged whilst the case was investigated by Monsignor Rapp, Monsignor Stumpf, and Father Iahor, S.J. Superior of the Jesuit house at Strasbourg. At the same time, Father Hauser, the chaplain of S. Charles, and Father Schranzker, a well-known scholar and psychologist, were to keep the boy systematically but secretly under the closest observation. It was decided to proceed to exorcism, and a priest of great reverence and experience, Father Suquat, was commissioned by the bishop to perform the solemn rite. At 2 o'clock on Sunday, the 3rd of October, Thibou was forcibly brought into the chapel of St. Charles, which hitherto he had always sedulously avoided, and when compelled to enter, he uttered without intermission such hoarse yells that it was necessary to remove him for fear of scandal and alarming the other inmates. The lad, however, was now held fast by the Abbés Schranzer and Hauser, assisted by Charles André, the gardener of the establishment, a stalwart and muscular Hercules. The sufferer stood upon a carpet, spread just before the communion rails, and his face turned towards the tabernacle. He struggled and writhed in the grasp of those who were restraining him. His face was scarlet, his eyes closed, whilst from his swollen and champing lips there flowed down a stream of thick yellowish froth which fell in great viscous gouts to the floor.
The litanies began, and at the words, Santa Maria, ora pro nobis, a hideous yell burst from his throat. The exorciser, unmoved, continued the prayers and gospels of the ritual. Meanwhile, the possessed blasphemed and defied their utmost efforts. It was resolved to recommence upon the following day. Thibou, accordingly, was confined in a straitjacket and strapped down in a red armchair, around which stood the 3 guards as before. The evil spirit roared and howled in a deep bass voice, raising a terrific din. The boy's limbs strained and contorted, but the bonds held tight. His face was livid, his mouth flecked with the foam of slobbering saliva. In a firm voice, the priest adjusted the demon. He held the crucifix before his eyes, and finally, a statue of Our Lady, with the words, "Unclean spirit, disappear before the face of the Immaculate Conception. She commands, thou must obey, thou must depart." The assistants upon their knees fervently recited the Memorare. When the air was rent by a hideous agony, the boy's limbs were convulsed in one sharp convulsion, and suddenly he lay still wrapped in a deep slumber. At the end of about an hour, he awoke gently and gazed about him with wondering eyes. "Where am I?" he asked. "Do you not know me?" questioned the Abbé Schranzer. "No, Father, I do not," was the reply. In a few days, Thibou was able to return home, worn and weak, but bright and happy. Of all that happened during those fateful years, he had not the smallest recollection. He returned to school and was in every respect a normal, healthy boy. Joseph, who had grown steadily worse, was meantime secluded from his brother, pending the preparations for his exorcism. On the 27th of October, he was taken very early in the morning to the cemetery chapel near Ilfurt. Only the parents, Monsignor Spies, Professor Lacherman, and some half a dozen more witnesses were present as the affair was conducted in the utmost privacy. At 6 o'clock, the Abbé Charles Bray said Mass, after which he exorcised the unhappy victim. During 3 successive hours, they renewed prayers and adjurations, until at last some present began to feel discouraged. But the glowing faith of the priest sustained them, and at length, with a loud groan that sounded like a deep roar, the boy, who had been struggling and screeching in paroxysms of frantic fury all the while, fell back into a deep swoon and lay motion law. After no long pause, he sat up, opened his eyes as awaking from sleep, and was overcome with amazement to find himself in a church with strange people around him. Neither Thibou nor Joseph ever experienced any recurrence of this strange malady.